Good morning. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, this week we have organized series of lecture on architecture in India. In 3 lectures, we will try to understand the different characteristic, different feature and cultural influence starting from the Neolithic period to up to this time. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Shankar Kumar. He teaches history in Hindu College in Delhi University and specialization in ancient India. And Dr. Kumar has also written a book on Indian history and culture. So I think his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic, architecture in India. So on your behalf, welcome him for the EduSet lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amrenji, and good morning, viewers. We shall today be talking about architecture in India, and the scheme of our discussion is that we will try and begin from the earliest times when buildings or dwelling units, so to say, were constructed, and that itself tells us that there is fair degree of historical insight into the exercise that we are pursuing. And since we know that man-made dwelling units, and here we are not talking of cave dwellings as such, but dwelling units constructed by men, designed by men, that can broadly be seen to have begun around the Neolithic times. And in the Indian subcontinental situation, the earliest times that we can ascribe to this is the era of Mehergarh Neolithic. Mehergarh is a site which presently falls in Pakistan, but since we are talking of the subcontinental dimension, we should be beginning from there. And from there on, we shall try and see how at different points of time in Indian history, people have conceived of space management. They have modified the space around them. They have carved or made some kind of a demarcation of the space around them, struck familiarity with that area, modified it, bringing it fair bit of aesthetics to that area. Also, the techniques that went into making such units, using the resources that were available. And since we are adopting historical insight, we would also simultaneously be looking at this particular thing, that primarily it is through local resources that materials were procured for building houses and buildings. Then as we move along in history closer to the present times, we will also see that there are quite a few other institutions and arrangements and historical developments that occurred and that impacted the way people saw space around themselves and the way they designed buildings for their purpose. And it is not only for the utilitarian purpose of living in a particular dwelling unit or a residence, but at times we find, particularly with the coming of the state, or here I mean coming of the territorial state in a big way, we find that quite a few other structures with different political and ideological intent also started being constructed in Indian history, and they served different purpose so far as merely using that structure for dwelling purpose is concerned. And thereon, as we move further, we find influences coming to building construction and space management from outside India also, or from other cultures, the immediate culture where such constructions are happening. If they come into contact with some other cultures within India or outside India, we find fair bit of influence coming in and some kind of a syncretization of those influences. and by the time we reach Mauryan period, we find fair degree of Persian influence informing the architecture of that period, particularly the state architecture, the big public monuments and so forth. And from there on, there is a fair degree of ornamentation happening around those buildings, sculptures get added to it, and as we come to the early medieval period and subsequently with the coming of Islamic influences through Delhi Sultanate and the previous contacts, we find fair degree of incorporation of Islamic architecture also represented through arches, domes, and so forth. And there are, this is a commingling of cultures, and architecture gives a very good window to explore how the cultural influences from and outside India have actually come together, got syncretized, and have given rise to beautiful architectural specimen in the form of buildings which are almost iconic buildings of the medieval period, Sultanate and Mughal period included. And next big thing in terms of influence, of course, happens to be the coming of the Europeans, or so to say British contact. And there we find the architecture or the space planning undergoing again some kind of a tremendous change. This is most visible in Delhi itself. Because the Purani Delhi or the Shahjahanabad, so to say, also existed while New Delhi or the you can say the British Delhi was coming up around the Raisina Hills. And one could see the contrast in the space management, in the building construction, in the techniques, and also the materials used, and some of the influences are very starking so far as Mughal and British periods are concerned. So the point here is that architecture can be a very good entry point to understand the threads of cultural change in India, right from the beginning of the times where buildings or dwelling units started being constructed. And it is with this intent that we have sought to begin our journey from the Neolithic times. Now, just a couple of words about the meaning and scope of our discussion. As you can see on your slide, the art or practice of designing and constructing buildings. This is the dictionary meaning, standard dictionary meaning of architecture. And of course, since this requires practice of designing and there is fair bit of artistry in it, so we can't move away from aesthetics altogether, although to begin with, it is primarily utilitarian in purpose. Subsequently, as our pattern of the discussion shows, that we shall be seeking its journey in the form of evolution through history, through changes, and also through fair degree of continuities. So it is one thing to keep talking of cultural influences from outside or beyond the frontiers of India, but at the same time there is a thread of continuity also, and that is something that will automatically get highlighted as we move along our journey through Indian history in the architectural sense. Then, of course, we would be taking care of, or we would be discussing the emerging patterns in the buildings. We would also be looking at the range or the varieties that these buildings present to us all through history at different points of time. Then there are compulsions. Of course, there is the constraint of transportation, there is constraint of weather, resource material. It could be mud, it could be bricks, it could be stones, it could be wooden planks, timber, and so forth, which go into the making of any building. Then, of course, aesthetics as we move along, and the sheer fact that architecture is not only about something utilitarian, but it's an art. That means that fair degree of imagination goes into this, and all the cultures across the world, we find that they leave some kind of a distinct imprint of their presence in architectural specimen also. So the local motifs, or even abstract thoughts of the afterworld life or paradise, or all kinds of things, they just get reflected somehow or the other in the architectural specimens that they leave for the posterity. Of course, during this exercise we shall also be talking of the influences, as we have already discussed, from within and from outside the country as well. Influences could come through the agencies of political contact, or trade contact, or even cultural contact. So that is something that that we shall be surveying as well. It is extremely important to understand that while we go along talking about the range of buildings or constructed specimen which are present, or which are present in partial state, and if we are trying to make some meaning out of it, if we are trying to get some cultural insight into it, it is important to look at the classificatory you can say the typological classification of such buildings. For instance, some buildings are buildings which are intended to be made for private living, civil kind of activity, everyday routine kind of a life. Whereas some of the buildings are made with the intent of showing it to the public, because it is a public building for social purpose, for public purpose, and there is some sense of the presence of the state in making such buildings. And of course, buildings for community use, buildings which are open for public engagement and participation, etc. So all these typologies are to be kept in mind while trying to elicit some meaning out of these architectural specimen. They are not to be seen merely as one piece of dwelling unit or one piece of constructed unit, but the political purpose behind it, the social purpose behind it, and at times it also serves some other functional requirements of the state, in the sense that it tries to give some kind of a legitimacy. We know of the Ashokan pillars, and how beautifully decorated and carved those pillars were, how nicely polished those pillars were. They were monoliths made of red sandstone, and so much so that during Tughlaq's period we find, despite not knowing that it is an Ashokan pillar, one Tughlaq ruler even got one specimen of Ashokan inscription, pillar inscription, imported to Delhi merely as an architectural marvel, as an architectural masterpiece. So it is not only what is engraved on Ashokan inscriptions which was important, but the sheer beauty, the aesthetic part, or the regality, or some kind of a sense of royalty associated with these monoliths were also important, and it could lend fair degree of credibility to the people who got it erected, who looked after it, or some sense of ideological justification probably was also transferred through this. We also know of the fact that Samudragupta, who is ruling around 4th, 5th century AD, got something engraved, something very important engraved on a pre-existing pillar, which actually was Ashokan inscription, Ashokan pillar at Allahabad, which is now known as Prayag Prashasti on account of what Samudragupta got written on it, got engraved on it. But probably Samudragupta was also not aware of the fact that it belongs to the king called Ashok. But of course, the sheer presence of that inscription in Prayag or Allahabad must have had some sense of royalty or importance associated with it, significance associated with it, although the historical precision with which we tend to know such a specimen was not known to the Gupta times, and yet Samudragupta got such an important inscription describing his conquests all over India engraved on it, and that again tells us that architecture or architectural masterpieces have to be seen in the context of whether it is a civil construction, whether it is a public construction, whether it is under the auspices of the state, or some kind of other sense, regality, etc., associated with such buildings or architectural specimen. Since our journey begins from the Neolithic times, you can see on your slide, this gives you the location of Mehergarh, which happens to be the earliest Neolithic site, excavated site in the Indian subcontinent. The beginnings can be traced to 7000 BC onwards, and almost up to the beginning of the Harappan times, we have continued Neolithic settlement in Mehergarh. Mehergarh, as you can see on your slide, is very close to Bolan Pass, and the building material or building designs we can see from around 3500 BC or a little bit before that, in the earlier phases of the Neolithic settlement. We can see use of some preconceived design of occupying space or of utilizing space. As you can see on your slide, this is of one of the earliest phases of Neolithic settlement, and this is how the design of the dwelling units could be reconstructed. This is a reconstructed version of what seems to be a habitation zone of the Neolithic people in Mehergarh. What is important for us in terms of material used is that they are using mud bricks. Of course, they were not kiln burnt bricks at this stage, around 4000 to 5000 BC, but they were sun-dried mud bricks. Nevertheless, what is important is that in the subsequent times during the Bronze Age period, say from 2700 or 2500 BC onwards, this is the area over which Harappan civilization flourished, and we all know that Harappans were prolific users of burnt clay bricks of very uniform size. And what Mehergarh example tells us is that some bit of such design of dwelling units, or the sense of utilizing space for living, had already been anticipated several thousand years before, during the Neolithic culture, which is exemplified by this example of Mehergarh. So that is the fascinating aspect of looking at the historical backdrop of architectural specimen, iconic architectural specimen with which we are so wonderstruck with. And if we look at the antecedents of these, here is one example that we can see. So that is about the Mehergarh example, and as we just discussed, that this is an example of Neolithic times, when man had just begun cultivating or farming, and they had a fair bit of surplus to store. And we can see that sedentarization in the lifestyle had made its beginning, and therefore fixed dwelling units, which are somewhat permanent dwelling units. And if we look at the archaeological profile of different periods, even preceding Neolithic period, we find that Neolithic layer is fairly thick. Neolithic debris, material debris, is fairly thick. That is because at the same place people lived for a good duration of time. And that meant that they were somewhat fairly secure in terms of their food supply and existential necessities. And that is how sedentarization began, and that's the beginning of constructing houses for dwelling purpose. And since they owned it for a fairly good duration of time, across generations perhaps, therefore they also tended to beautify the space around themselves, and there is some sense of a pattern that emerged. So it is not only on the basis of individual preference and style, but there is some degree of uniformity and pattern developing in these building constructions, and that is that gets fructified, and that assumes fair degree of standardization subsequently during the beginning of the Bronze Age civilization, during the Harappan and Mohenjo-daro times. But since we are talking of the subcontinental dimension of India's past, therefore it would also be interesting to look at the other slide, which tells us about Burzahom, which is in present-day Kashmir. And this is yet another Neolithic site, of course much later than Mehergarh, and the timeline for Burzahom as a Neolithic site could be put around say 3000 to 2000 or 1500 BC, and not beyond that. So here, as you can see on your slide, along the Himalayan foothills in Kashmir, we have another Neolithic dwelling unit. And what is distinct about this is that they dug deep into the earth, and hence pits. So these are pits, and they are pits not for some other purpose, not for some sacrifices or for some havan or something. They are dwelling units. People lived in it. Probably the roof could be thatched, and there are marks of poles, holes where poles could be inserted, and that's how they probably thought or designed their dwelling units. And this is extremely fascinating. So people living beneath the subsurface zone. Now, historians and archaeologists have pondered over it as to why they did it and what could have been the compulsions. One could be, of course, safety, other could be temperature, because all of us know that this is quite a cold area, and as we dig deep into the surface, the temperature, the average temperature rises, so it could offer some degree of warmth or maybe safety from some animals. But overall, this is culturally very fascinating and a diverse slice of the variety that architecture offers, even in terms of dwelling units and as back as Neolithic period. And that is another dimension to this. Similarly, we have quite a few specimen of Neolithic dwelling units from South India and eastern part of India. There are ash mound sites in South India, although they are not dwelling sites, but they are culturally very diverse and tell us about how space management is conceived in those times. And the cultural angle to this is still very unknown to us in the absence of enough information about it. So these are some of the aspects of this, and this takes us to the next phase. You can say a major leap is taken, and from around 2500 BC onwards, we enter into what we in history understand as civilizational period. Of course, there is connotation of urbanization, writing or script, coming of a script, trade and commerce, etc. From this word civilization, because so far we had been talking of cultures and diversity of cultures in architectural terms. And this slide tells you about the robustness with which Harappan civilization emerged. Of course, the Mohenjo-daro example and the state coming into being in a big way for public construction and so forth. So this is it up to this point, up to the beginning of the civilizational period. Maybe in the next series of lectures, we shall be taking it up from here, and would also include in our discussion not only the imagination or space utilization of private people from dwelling unit points of view, but also the intent of the state or intervention of the state into buildings and into architecture. So this is it for the day, and in case there are questions, Amlenji.
Today we wind up the lecture with this word, and we will discuss civilizational period like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and then we will have a more kind of discussion so that things will come out. So well friends, today we wind up lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on behalf I thank Dr. Shankar Kumar for giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.